Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I thought I would do a bit of a deep dive into the theme of how Germany is destroying the European defence industry. Now, clickbait titles aside, there's some rather interesting things to look at in this particular scenario. Now, the German defence industry is something that a lot of Germans, and especially German politicians, seem to be very uncomfortable to talk about. But in the light of the current events of what's going on in Ukraine, then European defence is now very much a hot topic. But what hasn't been talked about in great depth by many commentators are some of the decisions that Germany had made recently. So I thought this could be a really interesting thing to talk about. Now, there are two reasons why I have picked this topic. One is that there's lots of great negotiation themes to talk about here, particularly when it comes to addressing the issues of unintended consequences, dilemmas, trade-offs, and so on, and stakeholder management. These are all common themes that I talk about on this channel, and I think this is a great case that has those themes in it that are worth discussing. Second reason to talk about this is it's a different topic, and a topic I don't think many people know much about. So in the best traditions of YouTube, this is a video aimed at educating people, making them more informed at some of the issues. Now, I do know I have some German people that follow this channel, and they have made some great contributions in the past. So I'm hoping that I will approach this in a decent and balanced way, and that they won't get too upset with me, and perhaps even can input their own perspective into this, because I think that will be interesting. So, for anyone new to this channel, I am the collaborative negotiator, professional negotiator of over 10 years of experience, and I use this channel to talk about big strategic negotiation themes. So this is one of those. Let's get started. I think the story should start here with talking about Typhoon. And the reason why that is the case, because this is a particularly uniquely European construct. So for anyone who's not familiar, the Eurofighter Typhoon is a program that started in the 80s somewhere, and to cut a very long and boring and troubled story short, there are 4 core nations in the Typhoon program. Those 4 nations are Germany, the UK, Italy, and Spain. And they created the Eurofighter Typhoon Consortium, and this is managed by the NATO Eurofighter Typhoon Management Agency, abbreviated to NETMA. Now, this is a massive program, but the big theme that's important for this video is that those 4 nations developed the plane, developed the fighter jet. And what that means is they are the tier 1 nations. Now, the Typhoon has been sold to quite a lot of other nations as well. And the way this seems to work is that one of the 4 nations will sponsor the other nation that might want to buy Typhoon. So in this scenario, we know that the UK has sponsored Saudi Arabia and Qatar as customers of Typhoon. Italy has sponsored Kuwait as a customer of Typhoon, and I think they've got a campaign on for Egypt as well. Germany doesn't sponsor many campaigns, but I do believe they sponsored the purchase of Typhoon by Austria, and I don't know who Spain have sponsored, but I'm sure there must be some nations. But a key thing to understand is that whoever sponsors it cannot operate in isolation. For any export customer to buy Typhoon, all 4 nations, all 4 core nations, need to agree to the sale of Typhoons to those export customers. So what this is normally done is by agreeing something like an export license for the sale to the other nations. And of course, all 4 nations are incentivized to agree to those sales, because of course all sales generate what's called work share for the industries of all those four nations. So that means it doesn't matter who buys it, money goes into all four nations. However, if one nation really has a strong objection to that export customer, then Typhoon will not be sold to that customer. We're going to circle back to this point because this is what's important to understand for the rest of the video. Now, one of the issues that seem to have been quite hot in German politics is the issue of the civil war in Yemen. Now, I don't closely follow German politics, but what is relevant, so I can't give too much detail on this, but what is relevant to this video is the fact that Saudi Arabia had led a group of nations to intervene in Yemen. So for those who know a little bit about some of the recent history, it's essentially Saudi Arabia leading a coalition on one side and Iran supporting the rebels on the other side. Now, as a consequence of, and the civil wars fought by proxy, essentially. So, but those nations have intervened directly. And specifically, Saudi Arabia has used its Typhoon fighters and other fighters as well, presumably, to drop bombs in Yemen in support of the internationally recognised government. As part of that, there have been various accusations that the Saudi military have dropped bombs on civilians and other areas, and possibly some allegations of some human rights abuses. Park that to the side for now, because what is relevant is that in German politics, they do not want to support Saudi Arabia in this conflict. Now, going back to the previous point that I made, Saudi Arabia has Typhoons, and so Germany has to approve the sale of equipment in support of Typhoon to Saudi Arabia. So as a result of the German government taking what it considers a principled position on Saudi Arabia, they've introduced the Yemen Clause. And what that means is that they are blocking all defence exports going to Saudi Arabia on the basis that they believe Saudi Arabia has committed human rights abuses and intervened in a civil war. Now, to bring things up to speed, no doubt this has caused a considerable problem, particularly for the UK government. The UK government is the sponsor of Typhoon to Saudi Arabia, and this is a long-standing defence relationship that the UK has had with Saudi Arabia since the mid-80s. So, as a direct consequence of the German decision, the UK has been unable or struggled to properly support the Saudi Typhoons because the industry that supports that program cannot get export licenses from the German government. So this was deadlocked for a while. Now, there has been movement because Saudi and Iran did agree a ceasefire, broker a truce last year, and so there has been no direct intervention since. But what this has led to, and this was news at the more recent NATO conference in Lithuania. I don't know how many people picked up on it. But Chancellor Scholz did announce that the German government was going to unblock the export licenses to support the existing Saudi Typhoon and Tornado aircraft fleets. So that meant that support, spares, all that sort of stuff would now, companies could now supply Saudi Arabia with those equipment. But Chancellor Scholz further announced that there would be no new export licenses granted for any new Typhoons to Saudi Arabia until 2025 at the earliest. So, a bit of an opposition, you might say, but actually it is quite logical. Because the reason why is that in Germany, Scholz leads a coalition, and the Green Party are part of that coalition, and the Green Party are the ones in particular who are driving the Yemen Clause. So what Scholz has done is negotiated a compromise within that coalition. And the compromise is they wouldn't block the existing equipment, but they would not agree any new equipment. So perhaps not everybody going to be satisfied, but this is a coalition compromise. So this is a very typically German thing to do in terms of their politics. And so you might think, yeah, job done, problem solved. Well, not so fast. So the problem that Scholz has here is that he had negotiated a compromise that satisfied his coalition partners within Germany. However, this is a compromise that may not satisfy the partners that Germany has in NETMA, specifically the UK, possibly Italy and Spain as well. And the reason for this is that Saudi Arabia is currently running a future fighter program, a future fighter procurement, to replace its legacy F-15 and Tornado jets. And needless to say, Typhoon is one of the contenders for this program. This is a decision that's going to be made very soon. It cannot wait until 2025. So you might think, oh yeah, so what? Why does that matter? Well, we're talking here about a good £10 billion worth of program. That is a good £10 billion worth of industrial investment into European defence companies involved in the Eurofighter program. The Scholz is not really out of the woods here because he now influenced the situation in a way that causes significant harm to the ability of the UK government to sell more Typhoons to Saudi Arabia. Now, in a normal year, you might just say, yeah, well, these things happen. However, we're not in normal times. We're in times when European defence is a hot political topic due to the war in Ukraine. The investment into defence is now more crucial than ever, and this is a clearly stated goal by various European nations and the European Commission. And the only thing better than investing your own money into your defence infrastructure is investing other people's money into the defence infrastructure. So what this could result is the Typhoon program losing out on multi-million pound, multi-million dollar, whichever currency they use, program. Now we don't know who would win. I don't know all the others, but I do know that the French are also in the competition. So it is possible that what Germany is doing, or what the result of the German decision could be, is that Saudi Arabia chooses an American or a French jet instead of the Typhoon. Now, obviously, from a European perspective, America winning that deal would be pretty bad news for them. Less so with the French winning it. However, I am making a distinction between the French jet and the Typhoon because the way the French defence industry tends to work is that it's very much national based. A lot of it is basically within the borders of France. Now, France would benefit very greatly from winning the deal, but the wider European defence industry less so. To a certain degree they will, but to quite a bit less. So as a consequence of this German veto of the export, Germany is in the position of potentially causing harm to the other NETMA nations in the programme. And this is going to carry consequences. Now, I've already alluded to the monetary sort of consequences. Obviously, Saudi Arabia would then not be investing a good 10 billion worth into European defence. That would have a financial impact and obviously an industrial impact. So that would, and this is the thing you have to remember about these sort of big defence programs, is that by having more money in, you get more savings. You get economies of scale benefits. So there's a direct consequence to all the other people who buy Typhoon, in that the future purchase of Typhoon, the price would not be driven down by the quite significant Saudi buy. Because obviously they're running production lines for longer, and the longer you run the production lines, the cheaper the per unit price of those aircraft becomes. However, there are wider consequences as well, because, well, there's lots of arguments that can be made here. No doubt the German argument here is that they are applying a principled position based on the past action conducted by the Saudi Arabian government. However, I'm sure the UK government would be making the argument that if you want to influence how a country uses defence equipment, you have to be the supplier. And this is a well-known fact in the defence industry. The US government does this all the time. I mean, in all honesty, if you want to buy really good equipment, reasonable price, and don't mind someone telling you what you can and cannot do with it, then you buy American. They've got that part of the market buttoned up quite nicely. And that's something that a lot of countries tend to resent. Of course, if you buy Russian or Chinese, they come with no strings attached. The Russians or Chinese don't care if you commit human rights abuses with their equipment. So the UK government argument, no doubt against what Germany having a principled position, is that Saudi Arabia are going to spend this money anyway. So if Europe aren't the one providing the jets and perhaps putting the conditions on how those jets can be used, then Saudi Arabia may well just go to somebody else less principled perhaps. And it has to be noted that US and Saudi relations are not very good right now. So I'm not entirely convinced that Saudi Arabia would buy the US jets. So the question is, will they buy French? Will they buy Russian? Will they buy, I don't know if they can buy Chinese. No idea if the Chinese are involved in that. But that's one argument that can be made. There's also another wider argument. As I pointed out earlier, other countries such as Qatar and Kuwait, to name just a few, are also Typhoon customers. They will also note that Germany has applied this veto, and they will also be concerned about whether this could happen to them, and this could happen to future potential customers as well. Like I said, the Americans are somewhat notorious for controlling what people can and cannot do with their equipment. But they have the political, financial and military muscle to back that up. Germany does not. Germany produces exceptionally good equipment, but that equipment is not produced the same economies of scale that the Americans do it. So on a per unit basis, it tends to be a lot more expensive. But customers, particularly customers like Saudi Arabia, are willing to pay that extra expense as long as they have a greater degree of autonomy on how they deploy that equipment. So one of the consequences of this German decision is that not only that Saudi Arabia might not buy jets, but other nations, not even Middle Eastern ones, further afield than that, may look at this and decide, well, if you're going to do this, you might as well buy American, or actually, if you really want more autonomy, you buy from somewhere else. Possibly the French are more accommodating than the Germans, so they would be in a better position. I imagine maybe the Swedes with their Saab Gripen might start to look more appealing. And if Russian and Chinese jets have lost all credibility, then they may also be contenders. So the whole point is that at this point in time, with European defence industry needing even more investment, because of course defence spending is going up, Germany is putting off potential export customers. Now this does have an indirect impact on Ukraine as well, specifically when it comes to Typhoon. Because as I said earlier, having these big buyers like Saudi Arabia drive the per unit price down. It also tends to create more, more jets availability. What do I mean by that? Where, for example, let's say the Italians decide that they want to buy the next generation of the Eurofighter jet and retire their old ones, that means that those old jets could potentially, and I'm not saying this will happen, but they could potentially be made available for Ukraine. Now, of course, at the moment, the politics is such that Ukraine, the only jets possibly available for Ukraine are F-16 jets, and that's because there's so many of them, and that is because a lot of nations are divesting themselves of those old jets because they are buying either Typhoons or the F-35. So what this means is that Ukraine are very much in the second-hand market. Now, if big spending customers go and buy lots more Typhoons, then that creates a better second-hand Typhoon market. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the European nations are not offering Typhoon to Ukraine is because they don't have that many spare to go. So there isn't really a secondary market for old Typhoon jets because they're still using them. But the more that a production line runs, the more sort of spare jets potentially have to be available. Now, I know what people might say, well, that doesn't matter. Ukraine getting F-16s anyway. However, there is an argument for Ukraine to have in the future, obviously immediately, but in the future, to have both F-16s and a European jet like the Eurofighter. Because there's one thing that everybody had learned as a result of COVID, as a result of war in Ukraine, is that diversity in the supply chain is absolutely critical. And so for a country like Ukraine, for whatever reason, they could have their supply chain cut off. So they're going to want as many supply chains, as many reliable supply chains as they can get in order to, if one fails, then they've got another one that they can fall back on to defend their country with. So again, this is one of the wider implications of the German decision, in that it doesn't just impact Germany and German industry. It impacts across Europe, and it potentially could have a downstream impact on the ability of other European nations to, at some future point, give Typhoon to Ukraine. Now, there's some wider points that we need to talk about even still. Now, you see, German defence industry is still a very capable industry. They might want to talk about it very much, but you will find German products in a whole host of defence platforms. So particularly when it comes to land systems, they make good diesel engines, apparently. Of course, they're famous for making very good guns, and of course, who can forget the German Leopard tank? So there's a lot of German penetration in quite a few different defence programs. But one of the issues that's likely to arise from the Yemen Clause is that suddenly a variety of nations are looking at Germany and going, you know what, maybe we're not so keen in having them as a defence partner. And European defence programs work very much on the basis of trying to gather in as many partners as possible. So what does this mean? Well, there's two things that this means. Let's look at Poland. Poland has a ridiculous variety of tanks. I quite frankly don't know how they sustain them all. They've got just about every single tank there is. They've got T-72s, they've got American Abrams, they've got German Leopards, and I'm pretty sure they've got something else. And they're just about to buy Korean tanks, South Korean made tanks. Now, why have they done that? Why has Poland gone all the way to South Korea to buy their tanks? Now, it could be that the South Korean tanks are better value, they're much cheaper. That is an argument. But I think what has happened is that Poland has made a decision that they want to go with a more reliable partner, specifically a partner who's willing to let them onshore manufacturing capability in Poland. The German equipment, the German Leopard, is meant to be the best tank in Europe. Yet for some reason, the Poland have decided to go Korean. So the wider consequences is that European nations are now going to be looking for excuses to reduce German content in their programs as much as possible to prevent that level of control. More worrying still, we can go back to the issue of the Leopard tank and how long it took for the German government to approve the export licenses for various European nations to transfer their Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And this is one of the key things to understand about German decision making, particularly in the defence context. They are incredibly slow. And I think this is what people realise with the whole Leopard tank scenario, in that yes, those countries may own those Leopard tanks, but they don't get unilateral say on what happens to those Leopard tanks. Germany has to approve the retransfer of those Leopard tanks to another country, and that included Ukraine. Now, this, in the normal run of things, isn't a significant issue. This is normal practice in defence. However, because Germany has an uncomfortable relationship with making defence decisions, and this has very much been a legacy of Germany, perhaps going back all the way to World War II. They don't like to make decisions quickly, and we saw that with the Leopard tanks. But they don't like to make quick decisions about defence procurement quickly in a more general sense either. And if there's one thing that the Ukraine war has taught all nations, that the ability to move quickly and make quick decisions is critical. And you can see that in the way that the Ukrainians have moved. There have been lots of news coverage recently about the drone war happening in Ukraine. And that has been quite a game changer. And the reason for that is Ukraine has not waited to buy fancy, drones from whoever, the Americans and so on. They've gone out to the commercial market, bought as many drones as they could, as quickly as they could, and then modified them. And when those drones started, failed to be working because the Russians were succeeding in countering them or jamming them, then they bought a different set of drones and they made different modifications. So it's a constant arms race in sort of moves and counter moves, and it's all based upon making fast decisions. And if there's one thing many people have suddenly realised about the German system, is it doesn't like to make fast decisions. So in the wider defence context, a lot of nations are suddenly thinking, yes, German equipment is great, it's rather expensive, but they would rather not be dependent upon it. They would rather take something that is perhaps not as good, but gives them that greater tactical flexibility. And this can be seen, a great example is Poland, but other nations are soon going to be following. And this has all been triggered by the combination of German decision making on the Yemen Clause and Saudi Arabia, and their export license approval of Leopard tanks to Ukraine. So in my final sort of set of remarks, I can only say that there's a little bit of irony for Germany here, in that they've taken what they consider to be a principled stance in one nation, and they also, as a result of the Ukraine war, are coming to the table with 100 billion euros worth of defence expenditure. Yet for some reason, they seem to be struggling to be able to spend that money. They don't seem to be able to make decisions, and they don't seem to be able to find that many partners that are particularly enthusiastic to work with them and help them spend that money. So this is the dilemma that the German government now finds itself in that by compromising and agreeing a coalition deal, they have compromised their wider interests. So I'll backtrack a little bit to something that I've said on the channel before. When nations, in terms of their interactions abroad, on the global stage, they either act on the basis of self-interest or enlightened self-interest. Now, of course, there's always exceptions to the rules. There are always short-term deviations. So this could be one of those for Germany, where they've acted in a way which they've considered to be principled, but actually it's not in their self-interest, whether enlightened or otherwise. But that is a question, and people can have a valid and reasonable debate about that. Had Germany done the right thing in what they pursue as the Yemen Clause? Or had they actually created a whole host of problems for themselves, reduced their ability to influence events, and actually, right at the time when defence expenditure needs to go through the roof, created a roadblock, a problem that other nations now have to solve? In certain lights, it can be looked at that Germany, having principles, are creating consequences that other people have to pay for. And an easy example of that will be within the next few years, whether we see nations suddenly divesting themselves of German equipment and technologies, or insisting that even German companies reshore or nearshore their manufacturing plants so that those countries are no longer subject to German export licensing decisions. And it'll be interesting to see whether that happens. But this is the potential impact. It hit defence investment right at a really bad time, when the defence industry in Europe really needs to up the scale, up what they do. And it's very much, it could also result in increasing the shift of the balance of power in Europe. Let's talk about the defence side rather than the political side. But everyone knows that right now Poland is the country that is having increased balance of power when it comes to military. It's on the eastern flanks. It's been a huge supporter of Ukraine. It's becoming a hugely influential voice both in the European Union and in NATO, because suddenly Poland is a very, very important place for NATO to invest in, essentially. Yet at the same time, Poland's seeking to minimise German influence. So this could shift how people invest. This should shift how various nations make decisions on what is important for their defence in light of what Russia has done to Ukraine. And there will be a future as well in which those countries, in Europe in particular, will have to think about how they're going to invest in Ukraine. I am assuming here, of course, that there will continue to be some kind of support for Ukraine into the long term. And Germany will be part of that, no one should say otherwise. But it is significant that countries are not happy with German decision making and not wanting Germany to be the power broker that it perhaps should be. And you can very much see that in the attitude of the French, particularly Macron. Now Macron has for many years talked about strategic autonomy, and the French defence industry is very much based upon that principle. This dates back to Charles de Gaulle. They've always believed that you should be self-dependent to the greatest extent possible. Now, of course, that's not completely possible. We live in a globalised world. But the French, and Macron in particular, do believe that, particularly on defence matters, even to the extent that the French point out that they should not be dependent upon the US to the minimal extent possible. Germany seems to be taking an opposite view from that, and that is going to lead to future tensions between France and Germany. France is much more aligned to the Polish way of thinking than to the German way. And of course, it'll be interesting to see which way the rest of Europe leaned. Traditionally, they have been more followers of Germany, yet I am detecting that perhaps in the future that may be less so. So here's the irony. I open up the question. Is Germany right to have a Yemen Clause? Has Germany created unintended consequences? And what are going to be the future consequences for trying to compromise, but perhaps compromise in a way that will inevitably upset somebody? You can't please everybody. So I open that to discussion. I hope you found this topic interesting. Please do like and subscribe, and I do look forward to seeing any insights that people may have on this issue.